Hey guys, how's it going? I want to talk about the temptation of Jesus today because if you're someone that has been told that Jesus is God, or that Jesus is a God man, or that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, this view actually is problematic for your Christology because the writers of the New Testament are quite clear that God is someone who cannot be tempted, but Jesus actually was tempted. So take, for example, James chapter 1, verse 13, where it quite clearly indicates that God cannot be tempted by evil. That much is clear. God can't be tempted. And this should be self-evident. Nobody should actually have to say this because God is the creator of all things. God created Satan, so it doesn't make any sense that Satan would be able to exert any influence on an almighty creator. However, Jesus was a human being. He was the human Messiah, and so he was able to be tempted. And when the writers of the New Testament talk about the temptation of Jesus, they don't equivocate and say, well, he was only tempted in his humanity, but he wasn't tempted in his divinity. None of the New Testament writers say that because they don't believe in the doctrine of the two natures. That was invented in the Council of Chalcedon in the 5th century. That's not a doctrine that any single Christian in the 1st century held or taught to their converts. So let's look at Hebrews. In particular, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18 indicates that he himself was tempted. And it uses the additional pronoun there to make the point that Jesus himself was actually tempted. All of him in his entirety of his person. And then later in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, it says that we have a high priest who is tempted in all things as we are. The way that Jesus was tempted is the same way that all human beings are tempted. And guess what? All other human beings are not a God who assumed humanity, or a God that also is 100% man. That's not what all human beings are. The way that Jesus was tempted was the way that every single other human being was tempted because Jesus was a human being just like all of us. Imagine that. And then when you see the temptations, particularly in Matthew and in Luke, the temptations are outrageously ridiculous if you're to say that Jesus actually is God being tempted here. The temptation that, hey, Jesus, you're hungry, so why don't you turn these rocks into bread? Well, God doesn't need food to survive. God doesn't need that. So what would that even mean for a temptation? Or the temptation, hey, Jesus, why don't you jump off the temple and then the angels will catch you before you fall? Well, God is immortal. God can't get hurt by jumping off a temple. That's ridiculous. Or the final temptation, hey, fall down and worship me, Satan. Why would Satan try to tempt God with this? Why would God, who never worships anybody, want to be potentially tempted to worship someone else? It just doesn't make any sense. A much better, a much simpler, and much more straightforward reading of the Gospels and Hebrews, and even taking into account James 1:13, is to see that God can't be tempted. Jesus was tempted, so he's not God. He's a human being. And that's the simplest reading of the data that we actually have. Don't forget to subscribe.